This is Katie, co-host of Coffee with Keith and Katie. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
This is Dr. Mariah White, host of Your Life Matters, here on Public House Media. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media. Once you are done with this episode, I hope you'll come check out my show, Your Life Matters, where we talk about dreaming big and dreaming bold to reach your wildest dreams in both your health and your happiness. A new show comes out every single Tuesday. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes so you'll never miss an episode of Your Life Matters. Thanks again for checking out the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Welcome to Beauties and Headcanons, where we're nerdy and you probably are too. This is Lindsay, and I'm here today with both Emily and Elisabeth, and we're here to talk nerdy to you. Today we wanted to talk about what it means to be a nerd or a geek. And we were wondering actually about whether we are nerds or geeks, and whether you know if we're nerds or geeks too. And what that entails, what being a nerd entails, what being a geek entails. We have to be honest, there's probably a chance that most of us are a little bit of both. And when we say we talk nerdy to you, what does that mean? Or should we be saying that we talk geeky to you? We know you like it. We know you like being talked to nerdy to, otherwise you wouldn't be listening. And that probably means that you think you're a nerd. But are you a geek? We sometimes forget which one we are, and we wanted to tackle what that means and how great a thing it is.
This episode is brought to you by Squadcast. As podcasters who all live in different states and time zones, one of the most important things when we record, which we always do remotely, is the quality of our audio together. Current solutions like Skype, which we have used, and Zoom are dependent on the internet quality. Squadcast is a simple browser-based tool that requires no additional software to install. The audio is recorded locally as high-quality WAV files and then magically uploaded to the guest's computer. We've been using them for a few weeks now and love the experience. To get started, go to squadcast.fm for your 14-day free trial.
There's a couple of different definitions for both nerds and geeks, and they kind of overlap a little bit, but there are a little bit of differences for each of them. When we looked up the Google definition for nerd, it's usually list things like, a foolish person who lacks social skills or is boringly studious, just kind of single-minded expert in a particular technical field, so something like STEM related, like a science or something like that, or technology, which is, more of like a STEM field. And then compared to the Merriam-Webster Merriam-Webster definition, a nerd is an unstylish, unattractive, or socially inept person, especially one slavishly devoted to intellectual or academic pursuits. So again, kind of playing on a little bit of the learning aspect of it, rather than just kind of enjoying a particular thing. And then when you get into the geek definition, when you go to Google, it usually gives you something like same as a nerd, kind of comes up as like socially inept. Also somebody who engages in or discusses computer related tasks excessively or with great attention to technical detail. And then Merriam-Webster kind of further expounds on it, said an enthusiast or expert, especially in a technological field or activity such as a computer geek. In Wikipedia, actually had a really interesting definition of geek. It said it was a slang term originally used to describe eccentric or non-mainstream people. In current use today, it usually connotates an expert or an enthusiast or a person obsessed with a particular hobby or some sort of intellectual pursuit. And usually, referring to as a peculiar person, especially one who is perceived to be overly intellectual, unfashionable, boring, or socially awkward. So going by those definitions, I think I'm pretty solidly both.
I feel the same way.
I think I would kind of like personally differentiate them as nerd is more focused on learning and maybe in some cases more focused on like real life learning opportunities like science or history or math or something technology related. But then geek isn't necessarily like all about learning in that perspective, and instead they're more just like enjoying and just kind of reveling in a particular fandom, whether that be something science fiction or whether it be fantasy or comic books or video games or anything.
Yeah, I actually really like the summary of geek and nerd that Lindsay found on a post by Burr Settles. It's from a post in 2013, and they summarize a geek as an enthusiast of a particular topic or field, and they are collection oriented. And a nerd is a studious intellectual and are achievement oriented. So I kind of like that differentiation where geeks are collection oriented, where they like to kind of gather things about whatever they're passionate about and kind of, like a lot of geeks would have a collection of a certain type of fandom's artifacts or comic books or that sort of thing. And nerds are achievement oriented, where they're like, look at all of this work that I've accomplished and now I have something to show for it.
Right. Like I'm currently building this computer board, or I'm currently putting together this.
Like example here, a very good friend of ours is a computer engineer, and in college he had a simple assignment in one of his computer classes to create a program that would solve a very easy Sudoku puzzle. So he did that one, and then for fun he decided to make one that would solve the most impossible Sudoku puzzles, any Sudoku puzzle. For fun, he just did that. I would call that being a nerd.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like totally. He's a total nerd, but he's also a geek in a way.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of room for overlap with both geeks and nerds. Potentially, like, you learning things about fandoms, about like lore, or about if they have like some sort of science or something like that. I think some fans like to focus on that particular aspect, and then like other fans like don't really care that much about it. They just want to geek out about the show or the movie or the books.
Yeah, exactly. You want to geek out about it. You want to enjoy the fine points of it and discuss and have fun.
See, the way I see it is that if you're a geek, you're someone who just enjoys it. You enjoy watching it copiously or reading it copiously or collecting wands or whatever you do with your fandom. But if you're a nerd, you're someone who takes it a step further and would want to learn more about the nerdy aspects of it. So let's say that I wanted to watch Once Upon a Time. Okay. So if I was just not a geek, I would be like, okay, cool, whatever, Once Upon a Time, and I'd watch it and it'd be on television, no problem. But the geeky person would, then make a cosplay of the Wicked Queen, or get really into the sideline stories and possibly have a podcast about it or something like that. And then a nerd would be someone who would want to try and figure out how to make a map of Storybrooke and would want to try and figure out how to really delve into the universe that is Storybrooke, that kind of thing. So I always kind of figured it was like different levels of
I got you. I see what you're saying there. Because,
sinking into your fandom.
When you got to the nerd portion, they're actually like creating something, accomplishing something with the fandom that they were geeky about. And then they just took it a step further. I see what you're saying.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So could we say all nerds are geeks then? or not quite?
Not necessarily. So when I was at this convention this past weekend, I kept making jokes about how these were such nerdy people and they were my people. But I think I'm more of a geek than a nerd. And that's because like I feel that I love my fandoms and get me talking about them and I will talk about them. But without other people who are intellectually inclined and want to talk deeper and further about the science or the lore or the literature or the whatever behind our fandoms, I would just be a geek because I wouldn't have anybody to enjoy
I could
that
see
with.
that.
So I guess I'm like a social nerd, which is sort of like an oxymoron, but at the same time, it just is what it is. But I was like a kid in a candy store at this convention. So I was, looking at these models of Daleks, and my daughter got to sit in one, and I was going nutso. But without that kind of an environment,
Sure.
I would just be somebody watching Doctor Who on my phone at work. So that's the geeky part of me, wanting to watch the next episode, wanting to know when the next episode's coming out, or wanting to make my own sonic screwdriver. But
yeah,
the nerdy part of me
See,
sat
there's
and
my
watched a
nerdy
Tesla
side.
coil show.
And I relate to the nerdy side of things because I went to school to be, originally a forensic scientist, but then I turned into a chemistry teacher. So, like, I love all the nitty gritty scientific inner workings of stuff.
Right.
But at the same time, like, I am socially apt, I feel, I hope. Like, I have normal social interactions, but I also I don't necessarily produce things inspired by my fandoms necessarily. I'm more of a collector of information, and I just kind of love discussing it.
Mm-hmm.
So that would kind of make me more geeky than nerdy.
Right.
Yeah. I'd have to say I'm probably more on the nerdy end of the spectrum. I mean, I definitely have geek tendencies. I do like to collect and different things like that, but I really enjoy like having conversations and talking about it. I'm on a couple of different really cool subreddits with a couple of different of my fandoms that surprisingly are not, thankfully, not toxic. And
that's good.
Yeah, and it's really great, like the conversations that we can just have about just the nitty gritty details of little bits of lore and just the different levels that people are on. Because, like, in some fandoms, I'm still pretty much a noob, and there are these people who have been in these fandoms for years, and they just have all this knowledge, and it's like I feel like I'm never going to have anywhere close to this amount of knowledge, but I keep reading anyway.
I'm a part of a Facebook group that I'm learning about new fandoms like every day because I'll see posts by somebody and they're like, "Oh, I've loved this show. It was on like 40 years ago." I'm like, "I wasn't around, but apparently there's a fandom here." What?
That's what I really love about the archive of our own group on Facebook. It's where a pretty sizable group of the writers from Archive of Our Own kind of congregate and we talk. And I've actually gotten introduced to some pretty neat fandoms just through talking about it. And it's just really cool that it's just a kind of a safe space that we can go to and that we can discuss little things about our fandoms and get people's opinions on things and just kind of be ourselves and not have to, kind of worry about how we look to other people. Although I don't really worry anyway because I'm just far beyond that at this point in my life.
Yeah.
Well, see, and that's what I think is so interesting about it because we read the definitions of nerd and geek, and there's this socio connotation to both of them that are negative. Now, when there was that technological influx, there was a big change in the idea of nerdy and geek chic and nerd chic and all of that. So it really did change, and it doesn't really have so much of a negative connotation. But I do feel like people who are more nerdy inclined are more inclined to be around nerds as opposed to so much the geeky side of things. it's interesting because, you
Yes,
guys
we
love to
have
talk
them
about
everywhere,
relationships
Lindsay.
and shipping people. And we haven't talked though about like if you're a geek, you can be with a nerd, but I've read that
I
if
don't
you're a
know so
nerd,
much.
you can only be with a nerd. And socially, I think that being more extroverted is a much more geeky thing than because like I like people and I want people to like me and I want to like other people more. So
Yeah.
I am always trying to find more ways to relate and to, you know, be social. And I feel like that's not a nerdy thing.
Yeah. Well, okay. So going back to the, geeks can be with other geeks, but nerds can only be with other nerds sort of thing. I don't know. Because so that same friend who did the Sudoku computer program, he's engaged to my best friend who I think I would consider more of a geek than a nerd. Although she is nerdy in certain areas because she's an opera singer. So she's very, very into producing high quality music, high quality fine arts music. But she's also like literally into sci-fi and fantasy and that sort of thing as well, like Harry Potter and Doctor Who. She and I started watching Doctor Who together. Like, I don't know.
I think the kind of point behind that is that nerds, especially when, you really get deep into, whatever thing you're into, it can kind of consume you a little bit. And you therefore have to, be with somebody. I don't think it has to be another nerd, but it does definitely have to be somebody that will understand and, that um, they won't get down on you for doing that and that they'll even
Yeah,
accommodate it in some ways,
that makes sense. Yeah, you
Right.
have to have the empathy maybe for it.
Yeah. And kind of going back here just a little bit, just talking about the social aspect of it, just when I was growing up in the, what was that, early 90s? um, Being a geek or a nerd wasn't really, even then, still wasn't really seen as like a positive thing, or even just seen as like, oh, well, they're just a geek or a nerd, and that's just them. It was more
Right.
seen as definitely like a negative thing. But since certain things have gone more mainstream, I guess you could say, with like, the comic book movies and with all the different like series and stuff that's coming out, um, comic merch and, even just different geeky fandom merch and different, things like that are more kind of front and center. And so it's kind of a little bit more acceptable, I guess you could say,
Yeah.
to identify as a geek or a nerd because, oh, well, yeah, that's just something you're into now. It's not, yeah.
Yeah, I totally think you're right. I think now more so than ever, it's kind of like the age of the nerds and the geeks. We're kind of coming out of the woodwork here.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think it does kind of bring out some toxic tendencies in some of the older geeks and nerds because,
Yeah.
I mean, they, and understandably, they kind of grew up at a time where, what they liked and what they were into was looked down on, and it was, seen as not something that was cool or not something that they should really be into. And now, well, now we have all of this available in the mainstream, and it's kind of like this idea of paying your dues, I guess. Like, you didn't really
Yeah.
pay your dues. But the thing is if you like something, I don't think it really matters when it came in or how socially acceptable it is. It sucks if you had to go through, being ridiculed or, cast out of
Right.
a group because of it. But at the same time, I don't think it really gives people the right to do basically the same thing and
Right.
say that, oh, you aren't a true fan if you haven't been reading this since day one or watching this since it first aired or anything like
No,
that.
and I think part of it is because they're so used to having to defend themselves about it, and it's like a badge of honor to them that
Yeah.
they've
And
been
so,
around that long because they had to go through the trenches like that.
yeah, so their defenses is just kind of still
Mm.
up, and it's kind of sad in a way because I I grew up very sheltered, so I did not come into a lot of my fandoms until later in life. And I mean, I love them to death. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I've been reading a bunch of comic books, I've been playing a bunch of games, I've been reading a bunch of things. And I mean, if I'd had access to this, like, you know, when I was growing up, then yeah, I definitely would have been into it then. You know,
Yeah.
it's just, I didn't have the opportunity to do so. And I think, you know, no matter when you come into it, it's really just a matter of, do you like this? Okay, then you're a fan, you know, and then we
Yeah.
can sit down and we can talk and we can have a conversation. And if you don't know as much as I do, then maybe I can tell you some new things that might get you interested in something else. Or maybe you know something that I don't. So we can kind of compare our own knowledges on it, on that.
Yeah. No, that's really awesome. And I also think that kind of along those lines, everybody is maybe just a little bit geeky about something in their lives.
Oh,
And
yeah.
that could just be me, my personal opinion maybe, but like even the not traditionally geeky topics, I think people have a little bit of geek to a certain degree about other topics. I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying.
But at what point does a hobby become a fandom?
Right. Yeah.
Well, that's just it though. Like if I have to make sure that my DVR is set so that I can watch Jersey Shore, am I a geek about Jersey Shore?
Well, if you buy all their merch and stuff, I'm pretty sure they have like merch or had merch.
One other thing I wanted to say too, which is there's something also about how Elisabeth was talking about older people having some kind of claim to their nerddom. I think it's interesting that that could just become like a vicious cycle, because then there's a potentiality to get defensive about, well, I only had access to this fandom once I left my folks' house, so I would be
Oh,
more
yeah.
into it had I had the chance. But because I didn't, you know what I mean? Like there's the potentiality to get into a vicious cycle with people who feel like they're more entitled to their nerddom because of being with it the whole time, and those that weren't. To be fair, there's all kinds of time in the day to really geek out about things, but I can see the
Yeah.
social aspect of that
Yeah.
being a real problem. I'll never forget there was this one time where I was at a Halloween party, and it was right after one of the the second Guardians of the Galaxy's movies came out, and I was having a side conversation with a friend of mine, and I was listening halfway to some people who were sitting around a fire, and they were talking about nature versus
Oh
nurture
yeah.
and how Groot would grow up.
That would be a great discussion.
And I remember pausing the conversation that I was having on the sidelines and listening to them and turning to him and saying, "Are they really talking about what I think they're talking about?" And he just nodded and he's like, "Yeah, these are your people." And I feel like that's the thing. If you can take your fandom and talk about it in a way that's like even um, the Urban Dictionary thing says about how you are a nerd or you aren't a nerd is not. And I wanted to quote the very last part where it says, if you merely want to see what people think of when they think of the word nerd because human thought processes, societal constructs, and philosophy are so interesting,
Uh-huh.
consider yourself a nerd. So, on that part, I am definitely, because I love the idea of worlds within worlds and how those worlds interact with each other and how they socioeconomically, philosophically, thought process, human everything. I think it's the coolest ever. How did Cylons become self aware? All of that stuff is just the most amazing stuff to me. So I think that's really, I'm not like a sciency, mathy nerd, but give me some
Give you some lore. You're a lore nerd.
anthropology and I could go
Lore
crazy.
nerd. That's awesome. See, like, yeah,
I'm a
I would
lore
probably
nerd.
consider myself a lore or backstory nerd.
Oh, I think we've already established all three of us are, for sure. We've got Elisabeth to thank for that, I think, sometimes.
Yes.
I know Simon Pegg said this really awesome quote. I don't remember where he said it or when he said it. I know I heard it like several years back. But he said that being a geek, and I think this can apply to nerds as well, you know, just depending on what it is. But he said that being a geek is all about being honest about what you enjoy and not being afraid to demonstrate that affection. It means never having to play it cool about how much you like something. It's basically a license to proudly emote on a somewhat childish level rather than behave like a supposed adult. Being a geek is extremely liberating.
I really, really like that. And I also think it defends a little bit because I mentioned how I think you can be geeky about pretty much anything, even not traditionally geeky things. I just think of like the sports super fan in the stands at like Lambeau Field, like shirt off, painted green and gold all over his chest with like the cheese head on and like the weird wig. I'm like, how could you consider that like
And then,
a
like,
regular
all
adult?
decked
You know?
out in like Packer stuff. They have like Packer rugs and blankets
Yeah.
and knickknacks and doodads.
Yeah, exactly. I think they are sports geeks because they're collectors of all things of that particular team that they're a fan of. So, like, that's my defense for the fact that there could be sports geeks in the world.
I will admit that people who really delve into the math and the facts behind each player and their even I might even go as far as saying like things like fantasy football and strategically picking your team and strategically putting people out as opposed to not putting people out, that stuff. I hesitate to say this, but I do feel like that would be
Definitely.
someone who is a sports.
Yeah, sports. I would.
Geek.
I mean, if it's all about,
and maybe a sports nerd too. I mean, if you know the
facts and
the science behind
figures
what you're doing,
and the seeing
Sure.
how you can get the best fantasy score possible, I'd consider that nerdy.
Definitely.
when you aren't doing it out of luck and you're doing it more out of like strategy, gotcha. Okay, cool, no problem. But I do have a problem with things like the term beach nerd or yoga nerd. I mean, if you're a book nerd, you're just a nerd. I'm sorry.
Of being a nerd,
that's
but
just,
yeah,
that's just nerd.
I would agree. I don't know what a beach nerd is. It sounds like you read a book on a. Yeah, I mean, it sounds to me like you
think
just
it's
read a
somebody
bunch
who
of
hangs
stuff,
out
but
on
you're
the beach.
just happened to be at the beach.
Hold on a minute. It didn't
Yeah.
say anything about reading. It just said beach nerd. So I'm pretty sure if I am on the beach
I don't think that's a
a
thing.
lot, I could be a beach nerd.
Sorry,
And I think that's
not a nerd
a thing.
if you're at the beach a lot.
Right.
Oh, there was another quote that I really. Oh yeah. Well, okay. So should we discuss then? Do we talk nerdy to you or do we talk geeky to you?
I think we do a little bit of both, depending on the episode.
I can understand that. Yeah, I can get on board with that.
I think more than anything, we are geeky, but we talk nerdy because the whole concept of having a headcanon is a nerdy thing. It is going beyond what you're given and thinking and talking about something that is more.
And definitely the research that we put into episodes.
Or the lack thereof, because I'll be honest, sometimes I know very little about what we're talking about and I'm ready to learn about it.
Yeah.
But see, that's a nerd-like quality that you want to learn.
I like it. So we do, in fact, talk nerdy to you, although we talk about geeky things.
Yes.
I think we will. Indeed. So what about you guys, though? Talk nerdy to us. Are you a nerd or a geek? Did we get it wrong? Should we readjust our definitions here? We'd love to hear from you. Tell us which one we are and why you think that way, and which one you are and why. You can find Beauties and Headcanons on Facebook, Twitter, and Tumblr to share your nerdy topic suggestions. You can subscribe to this podcast and others from Public House Media on iTunes, Spreaker, Spotify, and wherever good podcasts are found. You can also, this coming week, I would think, look for an upcoming blog article about Beauties and Headcanons. If you do come across that article, be sure to share it with somebody in case they might be interested to listening to us. We also love feedback. So if you liked this episode, or even if you didn't, please give it a rating and a review so that we can help keep making great episodes for you. I'm Emily.
I'm Elisabeth.
And I'm Lindsay. And thanks for getting nerdy with us today on Beauties and Headcanons.
In the wake of a disaster, what one thing can you send that will help people the most? A blanket, a tent, a sandbag, a doctor. Actually, if you send a monetary donation, you send all these things. Even a small donation can make a big impact and can quickly become exactly what people affected by disaster need most.
In the wake of a hurricane, your monetary donation can make a huge difference to those in need. To donate, visit supporthurricanerelief.org. That's supporthurricanerelief.org. Brought to you by the Ad Council.